I have several research interests in the area of linguistics and India studies. Um Broadly speaking, I would describe the most important area as multilingualism and sociolinguistics and language contact, the relationship between one language and another in a multilingual society, and also the way in which languages of wider communication, such as Sanskrit and English, have had an impact on the other languages of the world, and the other way around, and how these languages have been affected by and changed by the regional languages and so on. And so I've also worked on psycholinguistics, uh, the way in which languages are stored in the brain and how they are processed. And also I have worked on syntax, in particular questions such as what is the nature of a subject in a sentence. And I have worked on morphology in terms of the relationship between morphological productivity and the rules of language change and things like that. And so these are some of my interests, and recently I have been working on World English. No, I'm sorry, this is not recent. I've been working for 30 years on World Englishes and on Indian English, in particular with reference to theories of second language acquisition and how these theories need to be revised and reformed in the light of the multilingual experience of traditionally multilingual societies in Africa and Asia and places like that. So these are some of my interests. Because all of these things are centrally related to intercultural communication. Because, for example, when you take something like Indian English, how do people in India communicate with one another using English as a lingua franca? So the role of a language like English in India is a lot more and different than just being a foreign language. And it was not even simply imposed on India, because Indians themselves demanded that the British government introduce English for modernization in the 18th century. And so that was one of the first globalizations and one of the first modernizations. And then even after the British left, after India became independent, English, if anything, became stronger rather than becoming weaker, because English plays a vital role in intercultural communication. India, as you know, has more than 300 languages. About 100 of them are spoken by more than 10,000 people, and some of them by 400 million people, and so on. And so they use English as the main instrument of education and for research and intellectual expansion. And so when you travel from one part of India to another, educated people use English. And so for intercultural communication, this bilingualism and multilingualism in English and other languages like Hindi or Sanskrit becomes very important, because it's a sophisticated culture with a long history. So for our traditional cultural parts, we use languages like Sanskrit and Persian. And for modern scientific and commercial and other areas, we use English. And for our cultural identity, we use our regional languages. And so most South Asians use 3 languages. So this multilingualism is crucial for communicating the various dimensions of one's personality and of the society. Well, in India, the interesting thing is that on the one hand, languages, some languages have died. On the other hand, most of the languages have lived and flourished. So language maintenance is the norm. in India, not language shift. So what we do is we add languages. So for example, Sanskrit is no longer used for commercial purposes, but it is very vital and very alive in ritualistic purposes and also in religion and in classical literature and many other aspects of that kind. And also Sanskrit gives the raw material and the processes for word formation. We were talking about morphology in the modern Indian languages for modernization. So, for example, if you want words for modern neuroscience or computer science and technology and so on, we take the roots and the word formation processes from Sanskrit and create new words. And so the new technical terminology is all very highly Sanskritized. So Sanskrit is alive and well in modern Indian morphology. And also what I think, and all the regional languages are more powerful today than they ever were because of the modern technology, and it's being used in, they're being used in regional educational systems and so on, and also for the media, etc. So, for example, my language, Kannada, it is spoken by as many people as in France, and it's only one of the 29 states of India, and it has a very long literary tradition and linguistic tradition and grammatical tradition and so on. So it is alive and well and flourishing. There's a beautiful modern literature in Kannada. So English hasn't killed it, but English has enriched it. And by the same token, Kannada has enriched English because in Indian English, a good deal of modern literature is written by people whose mother tongue is Kannada, and they have transferred a lot of Kannada features, stylistic features, to make Indian English literature alive and beautiful and vibrant. And so what I think will happen in 100 years is that all of these languages will be flourishing. But each one will have its own domain. They will not replace one another. Sometimes they will overlap one another. So there will be a lot of code switching and code mixing and so on. But I don't think the languages will die out as a result of the power of English. English will have its place. Indian languages will have their place. The real danger is to tribal languages, which are spoken by small numbers of people in remote areas, and the children don't, and the parents don't think that there is much future for their children to stick with those languages. So those are the ones that I think are in danger of extinction. But in India, even tribal languages have survived for thousands of years. With only 600 people, 500 people, 10,000 people, 5,000 people speaking these things and so on. So I don't think the general scenario of language endangerment works in India, because in India we believe in pluralism. We believe in diversity, and diversity is not treated as a liability or a problem, but rather as a resource for enriching your life. And so it is quite normal in India to expect your neighbor to speak a different language, to follow a different religion, eat a different cuisine, wear a different dress, follow a different culture, music, dance, and so on. So in fact, what is surprising would be if they also do the same thing as you do. And so diversity is the norm and uniformity is the exception. And so given that kind of an attitude, a pluralistic attitude, I think language pluralism will continue and multilingualism will flourish in India. And the same thing happened with English also. English came, English became powerful, it became important, but it is one of Indian languages now. It's not even considered an alien language in a serious sense. A lot of people use it for all kinds of purposes, and they are at home with it. And so that's one of the things that made the Indian diaspora easier, because they were comfortable with English. We have a policy in education called the three-language formula. The idea is that every child has the right to study, to receive initial literacy in his or her own mother tongue. So it would be, in the most cases, the regional language, that is the state languages of the 29 states. But in some cases, in smaller minority languages or minor languages or tribal languages, it would be different. So, but even in those languages, if there are enough students, then they have a right to study it in their own language. So they learn their initial language in either the minority language or the regional language. So it's called the regional language or the mother tongue. That's language number one. The second thing is the regional language, because each state, as I said, is like a country in Europe, like Spain or Germany or France or Italy. They're powerful entities, and they have their own culture and literature and so on. So it is very important that they identify themselves with those regions and be able to communicate in that. And so the regional language is the second language. And the third language would be Hindi. Hindi, which is the national language, not exactly technically the national language, but it is the language that is spoken by the most people. It's the official language of the central government. And then English. So basically you learn your regional language, Hindi and English. So that's why the 3-language formula. Sometimes it becomes a 4-language formula because the minorities, they have to learn their mother tongues as well as the regional language. So this is technically the case. But in higher education, English is very common. So that becomes the medium of instruction, because a lot of, in the rapidly changing scenario of science and technology, English is very important. And so the textbooks and the teaching in the colleges and universities and so on, that would be in English. And so most Indians are multilingual. So they speak at least 3 languages. I speak 5 languages, and all of this came naturally because each one performs a function for me.
Thank you very much for
You're
your
most
time.
welcome.
It was very enlightening.
Yeah. May I say a couple of things about my specialty in research?
Of course.
Okay. So one of the areas in which I have done some work, which has been well received in the field, is on code switching and code mixing. In particular, how a multilingual naturally moves from one language to the other, shifting from one language to the other, or sometimes even within the same sentence, moving from one language to the other. Now, that raises very interesting questions as to what are the motivations for this, and how are these things organized? How do you explain it in a theory of language? So, for example, is there a dual grammar, or what is the grammar of that sentence? So is there a dominant language, is there a less dominant language, and so on? How are these the differences in these grammars reconciled? For example, my language has a verb coming at the end of a sentence. In English, the verb comes in the middle, SVO versus SOV, etc. Now, when you mix these 2 languages, how are the grammatical differences reconciled? So that sort of thing. So we call it code mixing. And in particular, I've been interested in the syntactic and psycholinguistic aspects of it. So how are these things processed? For example, does it take longer for a bilingual sentence to be processed as opposed to a monolingual sentence, and so on? Also, another very important area of my research has been the relationship between second language acquisition theories and multilingualism and individual competence. So, for instance, the transference of one language into another in the course of learning a second language. Sometimes people have, in the earlier theories, used to think that this is very bad, and that this interferes with language learning and so on. And so I have argued with my colleagues that this multilingualism is so natural around the world that is basically the norm. and it's the monolingualism that is the exception. And so the natural convergence of these languages would be reflected in language acquisition as well as language use. And so an adequate theory of bilingualism as well as of second language acquisition and use should take this fact into consideration and not marginalize this or make it an error and demonize it and so on. So things of that kind we have done. And in addition, of course, I have done some work on the grammar of my own language, Kannada. So and several other things. So these recently I've been working on translation of Indian literature, Kannada literature, it's a great epic of 15th century into English. So all of these things involve multilingualism in various dimensions. I have also been talking about convergence, that is how when two languages come together, there is a tremendous amount of inter-borrowing, and from both directions. And so it's not only on the word level, but even on the grammatical level. And so as a result, a common grammar develops among the languages of India, which makes it easier to translate from one language into the other and to understand each other's languages and so on. So those are some of the interesting things. This is a very important central question actually in translation. So if you are too faithful, and that becomes often too wooden, the translation is not idiomatic and it's difficult for people to understand and so on. But the whole point of the translation is to make something interesting to them so that they would go on to read more and so on. So Shakespeare, for example, if I translated it literally into my language, nobody would read it. On the other hand, if we may have to take some liberties and to make it as idiomatic in my language as possible. The same thing with regard to the classic that I am talking about. So we would have to try to be as faithful to the original as possible, accurate, but at the same time also idiomatic. And so this is a kind of it's based on intuition actually. So you cannot write a rule or a set of rules about how to translate. But these are some of the considerations that are there in the back of your mind. And I would say that readability is the most important thing. And faithfulness doesn't have to be literal faithfulness, but in spirit it should be faithful.